James Carter sat at the weathered oak table in his modest Boise, Idaho apartment, his hands wrapped around a letter that burned with betrayal. The paper was soft and frayed, folded and unfolded so many times it felt like an old wound, tender to the touch. The words scrawled across it refused to shift, no matter how often he read them. His younger brother, Michael, had sold their family cabin, the one their parents, Tom and Ellen Carter, had bequeathed to them both, and kept every cent of the $200,000 sale for himself. James set the letter down, his fingers unsteady, as a deep, aching grief settled in his chest, mingling with a quiet rage that simmered beneath his skin. The cabin wasn't just a log house tucked into the Idaho mountains, framed by towering pines and a lake that shimmered like glass under the summer sun. It was the heartbeat of their family's history, a place woven into every season of their lives. James could still feel the rough grain of the porch railing under his palms, hear the rhythmic creak of the swing where their mother Ellen read them stories of pirates and explorers, her voice warm and melodic against the evening breeze. He could see their father, Tom, a park ranger with a weathered face and steady hands, teaching them to cast fishing lines into the water, his deep laugh echoing when they reeled in nothing but tangled weeds. The cabin's cedar walls held the scent of pine, the glow of firelight during winter nights, the laughter of card games that stretched past midnight. It was the last piece of their parents, Tom, taken by a sudden heart attack 7 years ago, and Ellen, lost to a slow, cruel cancer 2 years later. Now that piece was gone, reduced to a transaction Michael had orchestrated in secret. James leaned back in his chair, the kitchen's single bulb casting a faint, flickering light across the room. He closed his eyes, letting memories flood his mind like a river breaking its banks. He was 12, Michael 8, racing through the forest behind the cabin, their sneakers crunching on pine needles as they played explorers in a world of their own making. He was 16, sitting on the dock with his father, listening to quiet stories about the constellations above, each star a piece of a larger tale. He was 25, kneeling by his mother's hospital bed, her frail hand gripping his as she whispered, "You and Michael, take care of each other." Michael had been there too, his face wet with tears, nodding as if her words were a vow. James had trusted him then, believed their brotherhood would endure. They were opposites, James rooted, finding peace in routine, Michael restless, always chasing the next horizon. But they were Carters, bound by blood and memory. Or so James had thought. The letter from the lawyer, Linda Harper, told a colder truth. 6 months ago, Michael had sold the cabin, using a power of attorney to bypass James's signature. The document was dubious, Linda noted, possibly forged or manipulated through some legal sleight of hand, but unraveling it would require time, money, and a fight James wasn't sure he had in him. The sale had cleared $200,000, enough to ease the weight of James's life, to pay off his aging car, save for his son's college fund, or simply breathe without the constant pressure of making ends meet. Instead, the money had vanished into Michael's world, a place James glimpsed only through fleeting social media posts. A gleaming black Mustang, parked outside a sleek Phoenix condo, a trip to Vegas with strangers flashing champagne bottles, a life polished to a shine that felt alien to the brother who'd once shared a cramped bunk bed with him in their childhood home. James picked up his phone, Michael's number glowing on the screen like a challenge. His thumb hovered over the call button, but his anger held him back, a knot tightening in his throat. What could he say? "Why did you steal from me? From us?" The words felt too raw, too final, like a door slamming shut on the last hope of reconciliation. He set the phone down and paced to the window, gazing out at the quiet Boise street where streetlights cast soft pools of light against the dusk. Boise was home, always had been. After their parents passed, James had stayed, building a life with Sarah, his high school sweetheart, and their 10-year-old son, Ethan. His job as a high school history teacher paid just enough for their small apartment, for books stacked on every shelf, for Ethan's soccer cleats and school supplies. He'd never craved wealth or adventure, just his family, his students, and the cabin, a refuge where the world's noise fell away. Michael, though, had always hungered for more. He'd left Boise a decade ago, chasing real estate deals in Phoenix, then tech startups in San Francisco, then vague investment opportunities that shifted with every phone call home. Sarah stepped into the kitchen, her navy scrubs creased from a 12-hour shift at St. Luke's Hospital. As a nurse, she had a gift for reading James's silences, her hazel eyes seeing past his guarded exterior. "You're still holding that letter," she said, her voice soft but laced with concern as she glanced at the table. James exhaled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his thoughts. "I can't let it go, Sarah. We were supposed to decide together. It was ours. Mine, his, Ethan's. It was Mom and Dad." Sarah pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her hands folded in a way that grounded him. "Have you called him?" "Not yet." His voice was low, rough with frustration. "I don't know if I can talk to him without losing it." She reached for the letter, her eyes scanning the legal terms with the precision she brought to her work. "This says you might have a case. Forgery or improper use of the power of attorney. The lawyer could dig deeper." James shook his head, his jaw tight. "A lawsuit? That's years of fighting, more bills we can't afford. And even if I win, the cabin's gone." He met her gaze, his brown eyes heavy with a loss that went beyond money. "It's not just the cash, Sarah. It's what it meant. For us, for Ethan, for everything we had left of them." Sarah nodded, her expression softening with understanding. The cabin had been their haven too. After Ethan was born, they'd spent countless weekends there, teaching him to skip stones across the lake's glassy surface, to build campfires that crackled under the stars, to spot deer grazing in the early morning mist. Ethan still drew pictures of the cabin, tacking them to his bedroom wall with pride, asking when they'd return. James hadn't found the words to tell him the place he loved was now someone else's, its memory sold off like a stranger's trinket. "You need to talk to Michael," Sarah said, her tone gentle but resolute. "Not about the lawyer. Not yet. Just hear what he has to say." James's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. He didn't want to hear Michael's excuses, his justifications. He wanted to drive to Phoenix, pound on Michael's door, and demand to know why he'd shattered their family's legacy for a paycheck. But Sarah's calm presence was a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of his anger. "Maybe," he said, the word heavy with reluctance, like admitting defeat. That night, James lay awake beside Sarah, the ceiling a blank canvas for his restless thoughts. Memories of Michael flooded back, the kid who'd trailed him everywhere, who'd once given him his favorite baseball card to cheer him up after a bad day at school. Where had that brother gone? He thought of their parents, wondering if they'd sensed Michael's hunger for more, his need to outrun the small-town life they'd built. He thought of the cabin, its memory so vivid he could almost smell the pine, hear the lake lapping at the shore. Now it was just a line in a real estate contract, erased by a brother he barely knew anymore. The next morning, James called Linda Harper, the lawyer whose letter had upended his world. Her voice was crisp but kind, a professional warmth that steadied him. "Mr. Carter, the power of attorney Michael used raises red flags," she said. "It might be forgery, or at least a misuse of authority. We can file a claim, but it'll take time. Months, maybe years. You'd need to prove you were never informed." "How could he even pull this off?" James asked, pacing the living room, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand running through his hair. "Loopholes," Linda replied, her tone matter of fact. "People exploit them with shared property. Signatures can be faked, documents backdated. It's more common than you'd think. I can start investigating, but I need your approval to proceed." James hesitated, his mind racing. A lawsuit meant dragging their family's pain into a courtroom, exposing their grief to strangers who'd never known the cabin's warmth. But doing nothing meant letting Michael walk away unscathed, his betrayal unaddressed. "I'll think it over," he said, thanking her before ending the call. That evening, James sat with Ethan on the couch, helping him with math homework. Ethan's pencil scratched across the page, his tongue poking out in concentration as he worked through fractions. "Dad," he said suddenly, looking up with wide, hopeful eyes. "When are we going back to the cabin? I want to fish like we did last time, when I caught that big trout and you said I was better than you." James's heart twisted, a sharp pang of guilt and loss. He ruffled Ethan's hair, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll find new places to fish, buddy. New adventures, okay?" Ethan nodded, but his expression was uncertain, as if he sensed the truth his father couldn't say. James's thoughts drifted to Michael, to the choices that had fractured their family, to the legacy they'd lost. He picked up his phone, Michael's number glowing on the screen like a dare. This time, he pressed call. The phone rang 3 times, then went to voicemail. Michael's voice, smooth and polished, filled the room. A stranger's voice in a brother's guise. "Hey, you've reached Mike Carter. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." James hung up, the silence deafening. Sarah watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes soft but steady. "Keep trying," she said quietly, her voice a gentle anchor in the storm of his thoughts. Over the next week, James tried to lose himself in his routine, grading essays on the Civil War, teaching classes with a practiced calm, driving Ethan to soccer practice under Boise's wide, open skies. But the cabin haunted him, a wound that refused to close. He called Michael again, then again, each time greeted by the same voicemail. Finally, he left a message, his voice steady but raw, each word carved from the hurt he carried. "Mike, it's James. We need to talk about the cabin, about what you did. Call me back." Weeks passed, and Michael didn't call. James and Sarah began gathering evidence. Ellen's will, old letters, property records, anything that might help Linda build a case. They spent evenings in their attic, sorting through boxes dusty with time, each one a portal to the past. They found photos of the cabin, James and Michael as kids, grinning by the lake with fishing poles, their faces freckled from the sun. Their parents on the porch, arms around each other, smiling at a camera held by a neighbor. Each image was a knife, cutting deeper into James's anger and nostalgia, a reminder of what they'd lost. One night, surrounded by scattered papers and fading photographs, Sarah looked up, her face lit by the soft glow of a lamp. "What if you wrote him a letter? Not a legal one, but from you. Tell him what the cabin meant, what this has done to you, to us." James frowned, his skepticism a shield against hope. "He won't read it. He's been dodging me for months." "Maybe," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm, like a hand guiding him through the dark. "But you'll know you said what you needed to say. You'll know you tried." The idea lingered, though James resisted it at first. He didn't want to bare his soul to someone who'd betrayed him, who'd chosen money over memory. But Sarah's words took root, and that weekend he sat down with a pen and notebook, the kitchen table cleared of everything but his thoughts. The words came haltingly, then flowed like a river, each one carrying a piece of his heart. He wrote about their childhood at the cabin, swimming in the lake until their fingers pruned, building forts in the woods, roasting marshmallows under a sky thick with stars. He wrote about their parents, about Ellen's wish for them to stay close, about Tom's pride in their brotherhood. He wrote about Ethan, about the memories he'd wanted to pass down, the stories he'd hoped to tell by that same lake. And he asked Michael, simply, why? Why he'd chosen to break their family for a paycheck. When he finished, James read the letter aloud to Sarah, his voice breaking as he spoke of their parents, of the cabin's loss, of the brother he missed despite everything. Sarah listened, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes bright with tears she didn't let fall. "Send it," she said when he was done, her voice thick with emotion, a quiet strength that held him up. James mailed the letter the next day, sliding it into the mailbox with a quiet resolve, the act feeling like a small reclaiming of his voice. He didn't know if Michael would read it, or if it would change anything. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of release, as if he'd loosened the knot of pain that had bound him since the letter arrived. A month later, James was in his classroom, wrapping up a lesson on the Reconstruction era, his voice steady as he guided his students through the complexities of history. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a soft vibration that pulled him from his thoughts. He waited until the students filed out, their chatter fading down the hall, before checking it. A text from Michael. "Got your letter. I'm coming to Boise. We need to talk." James stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest, a mix of hope and dread coursing through him. He didn't know what Michael would say, or if he'd even show up. But for the first time in months, there was a chance, a fragile, flickering chance, that they could face what had happened, not as strangers locked in a legal battle, but as brothers searching for a way back to each other. Sarah smiled when he told her that evening, pulling him into a hug that felt like home. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice warm and steady, a beacon in the uncertainty ahead. James nodded, the weight in his chest easing just a fraction, like a crack of light breaking through a storm. The cabin was gone, but maybe their family, their story, still had a chance to be salvaged. If only they could find the courage to speak the truths they'd buried for too long. James Carter stood in his living room, the curtains drawn back to reveal a Boise street where autumn's first golden leaves drifted lazily to the ground. The air felt heavy, charged with the anticipation of a storm, as he waited for his brother Michael to arrive. It had been a week since Michael's text. "Got your letter. I'm coming to Boise. We need to talk." And each day had stretched James's nerves tighter, like a bowstring, ready to snap. He hadn't seen Michael in nearly 2 years, not since their mother's memorial, where they'd exchanged little more than stiff nods and polite words. Now, the cabin's loss loomed between them, a silent accusation James wasn't sure he could voice without shattering what little remained of their bond. Sarah was at St. Luke's Hospital, her nursing shift stretching into the late afternoon, leaving James alone with his thoughts. Ethan, their 10-year-old son, was at school, his backpack slung over his shoulder that morning as he'd asked, yet again, when they'd return to the cabin. James had mumbled something vague about new adventures, but Ethan's hopeful eyes had pierced him, a reminder of the truth he couldn't yet share. On the coffee table lay the lawyer's letter, its legal jargon a stark reminder of Michael's betrayal. Next to a stack of faded photos, snapshots of James and Michael as boys, grinning by the lake with fishing poles, their faces freckled from summer sun. Those images felt like fragments of a lost world, a time when trust was as natural as breathing, not a fragile thing to be questioned. The doorbell rang, sharp and jarring, pulling James from his reverie. His heart thudded as he crossed the room, his hand pausing on the knob, as if opening the door would unleash something he couldn't control. When he swung it open, there was Michael, both familiar and strange. His dark hair was slicked back, his leather jacket sleek and expensive, his posture carrying the easy confidence James remembered from their youth. But there were new lines around Michael's eyes, a hardness etched into his features, and his smile was tight, almost wary, like a man stepping into unfamiliar territory. "James," Michael said, his voice smooth but cautious, like someone testing the ice. "Good to see you." James nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "You too," he said, though the words tasted hollow, like an obligation rather than truth. He gestured to the couch, and they sat, the space between them heavy with unspoken history. The living room, with its worn furniture, Ethan's crayon drawings taped to the walls, and a bookshelf sagging under the weight of history texts, felt small and lived in compared to the polished life Michael had built in Phoenix. Michael glanced around, his eyes catching on a framed photo of their parents on the mantel, Tom and Ellen, arms around each other, smiling on the cabin's porch. "Place hasn't changed much," he said, his tone aiming for lightness, but falling flat, like a note out of tune. James didn't respond, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles pale. He wanted to demand answers, to ask about the cabin, but the words lodged in his throat, sharp and unyielding. Instead, he said, "Why didn't you call me back? I left messages, Mike, weeks of them." Michael shifted, his gaze dropping to the floor, his fingers fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket. "I know. I've been swamped. Things got messy, James. I didn't know how to start that conversation." "Messy?" James's voice sharpened, the anger he'd bottled for months spilling over. "You sold our cabin, Mike. Our cabin. Without a word to me. You call that messy?" Michael's jaw tightened, but he met James's eyes, his own flickering with something, guilt maybe, or defensiveness. "It wasn't supposed to go like that," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "I was in a hole, James. Bad investments, debts piling up, people breathing down my neck. I needed the money. I didn't think it would hit you this hard." James stared at him, disbelief warring with the ache in his chest. "Didn't think it would hit me? That cabin was all we had left of Mom and Dad. You knew what it meant. To me, to Ethan, to our family. And you sold it for what? A car? A condo? A trip to Vegas?" Michael leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands rubbing together as if trying to warm them against a chill only he felt. "It's not like that," he said, his voice rougher now. "I was drowning, James. You don't know what it's like out there, trying to keep up, trying to build something. I thought I could fix it. Pay you back later, make it right." "Pay me back?" James's voice rose, trembling with the weight of his hurt. "You sold our history, Mike. You didn't even ask. You forged papers or twisted some legal loophole and left me with nothing. How do you pay back something like that?" Michael flinched, his confident facade cracking like thin glass. "I didn't forge anything," he said, but his voice wavered, lacking the certainty he usually wore like armor. "The lawyer said it was legal, said the power of attorney covered it. I thought you'd get it, eventually." James stood, pacing to the window, his hands clenched into fists. "Get it? You didn't give me a chance to get it, you just did it. And now it's gone. Ethan keeps asking when we're going back, drawing pictures of the lake, and I don't know how to tell him his uncle sold his favorite place for, what, your lifestyle?" Michael's face reddened and he stood too, his voice rising to match James's. "It's not about a lifestyle, James. I was trying to save my business, my future. You think I wanted to lose the cabin? It meant something to me too. Those summers, Mom's stories, Dad's fishing lessons. I didn't do this to hurt you." "Then why didn't you talk to me?" James turned, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "We're brothers, Mike. You could have called. Said you were in trouble. I would have helped. We could have figured it out together, sold it properly, split it fairly, anything but this." Michael looked away, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining from him. "I didn't want you to see me like that," he said quietly. "Failing. Again. You've always had it together, James. Your job, your family, this life you built here. I didn't want to come crawling back, admitting I'd screwed up again." James shook his head, his anger softening into something heavier, sadder, like grief for the brother he'd lost long before the cabin. "You think I've got it together? I'm scraping by, Mike. Teaching doesn't pay much. Sarah's working double shifts. That cabin was my escape, my way to keep Mom and Dad alive for Ethan, and you took it." The room fell silent, the weight of their words settling like dust after a storm. Michael sank back onto the couch, his hands covering his face for a moment before he spoke. "I messed up, James. I thought I could fix it before you found out. I was going to tell you, I swear, but every time I tried, I couldn't." James stayed by the window, his body still tense, but he listened. He wanted to believe Michael, to find some trace of the brother who'd once shared his secrets by the lake. But trust was a fragile thing, and Michael had shattered it. "When were you going to tell me?" he asked, his voice quieter now, raw with exhaustion. "After you paid off your debts? After you bought that condo? When?" Michael didn't answer right away, his eyes fixed on the floor, his fingers tracing the edge of the couch. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I kept putting it off. Every time I thought about calling, I saw you judging me, and I couldn't face it." James felt a pang of something like pity, but it was buried under layers of hurt. He thought of their mother's words, her plea for them to take care of each other. He thought of Ethan, who deserved to know his uncle as more than a shadow in their family's story. "You should have tried," he said, his voice steady but laced with pain. "You should have trusted me, Mike." Michael nodded, his expression heavy with regret, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "I know. I'm here now, though. I want to make this right, or at least try." James studied his brother, searching for the boy who'd once looked up to him, who'd shared dreams under the stars. He wasn't sure that boy was still there, but he wanted to believe he was, somewhere beneath the mistakes and the years. "How do you make this right?" he asked, his voice soft but pointed. "The cabin's gone, the money's gone. What's left?" Michael hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, its edges slightly crumpled. "This is a start," he said, sliding it across the coffee table. "It's 10 grand. I know it's not the cabin, not even close, but it's what I could pull together. I sold some things, called in favors. It's something." James stared at the envelope, his heart a tangle of anger, hope, and weariness. He didn't reach for it, his hands staying firmly in his pockets. 10 grand doesn't bring back what we lost," he said, his voice low. "It doesn't fix what you did to us." "I know," Michael said, his voice breaking, a crack in his polished exterior. "But I'm trying, James. I don't know what else to do right now." James looked at his brother, the silence stretching like a taut wire. He thought of Sarah, who'd urged him to talk, to listen, even when he wanted to shut Michael out. He thought of Ethan, who deserved a family that wasn't broken by greed or silence. He thought of their parents, whose love had built that cabin, whose memory deserved better than this rift. "Stay for dinner," he said finally, the word surprising even himself. like a step into uncharted territory. "Ethan will want to see you. We'll talk more." Michael's eyes widened, a flicker of relief crossing his face, softening the lines of tension. "Yeah," he said, his voice soft, almost grateful. "I'd like that." That evening, Sarah came home to find Michael on the couch, Ethan beside him, proudly showing off a drawing of the lake, its blue crayon waves vivid against the paper. James watched from the kitchen, his heart caught between caution and a fragile hope. Sarah caught his eye, her smile small but warm, a silent question in her gaze. "You okay?" she whispered, squeezing his hand as she joined him by the counter. James nodded, though uncertainty lingered. "We're talking," he said quietly. "It's a start." Over dinner, the conversation was careful, like navigating a minefield. Ethan peppered Michael with questions about Phoenix, about the desert's heat, the cacti, whether he'd seen scorpions or rattlesnakes. Michael answered with a charm that echoed their father's, spinning stories of city lights and desert sunsets that made Ethan laugh, his eyes bright with wonder. But James saw the strain in Michael's smile, the weight of their earlier words lingering like a shadow. After Ethan went to bed, his laughter fading upstairs, the brothers sat at the table, the envelope still untouched between them, a silent reminder of their divide. "I looked into the sale," Michael said, breaking the quiet, his voice hesitant. "The lawyer I worked with, he wasn't straight with me. There's a chance we could challenge it, maybe recover some of the money. Not the cabin, but something." James raised an eyebrow, his skepticism sharp. "You're saying you got played too?" "Maybe," Michael admitted, his eyes fixed on the table. "I was desperate, James. I trusted the wrong people, signed things I didn't fully understand. I'm still trying to piece it together." James leaned back, his mind racing, torn between hope and doubt. A part of him wanted to believe Michael, to see this as a mistake rather than a deliberate betrayal. But another part wondered if this was just another story, a way to dodge accountability. "What's the lawyer's name?" he asked, his voice even. "I'll have Linda check it out." Michael nodded, scribbling a name and number on a napkin, his hand unsteady. "I'll help, whatever it takes. I owe you that, James. I owe you more than that." James took the napkin, his fingers brushing the paper as if testing its truth. He didn't know if Michael's offer was genuine, or if it was a gesture to ease his own guilt. But for the first time, he felt a crack in the wall between them, a possibility, however faint, that they could find a path forward, even if it was paved with uncertainty. As Michael left that night, promising to stay in touch, James stood on the porch, watching his brother's car disappear into the Boise night, its taillights fading into the dark. He thought of the cabin, of the memories they'd never reclaim, of the summers that lived only in photographs now. He thought of Ethan, sleeping upstairs, and Sarah, who'd stood by him through every step of this pain. And he thought of Michael, flawed and human, reaching out in his imperfect way, trying to bridge a gap he'd created. When James went back inside, Sarah was waiting, her eyes searching his, her presence a steady anchor. "How'd it go?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. "He's trying," James said, his voice quiet, heavy with the weight of the day. "I don't know if I trust him yet, but he's here. That's something." Sarah nodded, pulling him into a hug that felt like home, her warmth easing the tension in his shoulders. "That's enough for now," she said, her voice a beacon in the uncertainty ahead. James held her, the envelope still on the table, a small gesture in a sea of loss. He didn't know what the next steps would bring, whether Michael's promises held weight, whether the lawyer could salvage anything from the wreckage. But for the first time, he felt like they were moving toward something. Not the cabin, but a chance to rebuild what had been broken, to find a way to be brothers again. In the weeks after Michael's visit, James Carter lived in a strange, unsteady rhythm, balancing a fragile hope against the weight of his lingering skepticism. The envelope Michael had left, $10,000 in a cashier's check, sat untouched in a kitchen drawer. Its presence a quiet challenge James wasn't ready to face. Opening it felt like accepting a half measure, a gesture that couldn't undo the loss of the cabin, their family's last tether to their parents' memory. He and Sarah had agreed to let Linda Harper, the lawyer, investigate the sale, using the name and number Michael had scribbled on a napkin. Richard Vance, the attorney who'd facilitated the deal. Linda's updates came sporadically, her voice steady but cautious as she navigated a maze of legal complexities. Missing disclosures, questionable signatures, and vague promises of progress. James tried to anchor himself in his routine, teaching history classes at Boise High, grading essays on the American Revolution, driving Ethan to soccer practice under the wide Idaho sky. But the cabin's absence was a constant ache, a shadow that colored every quiet moment. Michael, to James's surprise, didn't return to Phoenix. He rented a small apartment downtown, a modest place that contrasted sharply with the polished life he'd projected in his social media posts. He called or texted every few days, sometimes to share small updates about Vance, sometimes just to check in, his tone earnest, almost desperate, as if he were trying to rebuild a bridge he'd set ablaze. James listened, responded, but kept his guard up, the sting of Michael's betrayal too raw to fully let go. Yet there were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when James glimpsed the brother he'd known as a boy, the one who'd shared secrets by the lake, who'd laughed until tears streamed down his face during their childhood summers at the cabin. Those glimpses kept James from closing the door entirely, though trust remained a distant, uncertain thing. One crisp Saturday morning, Michael showed up unannounced at James's apartment, a paper bag of bagels in one hand, a tray of coffee in the other. His leather jacket swapped for a plain sweater that made him look less like the slick entrepreneur and more like the brother James remembered. Ethan answered the door, his face lighting up with a grin. "Uncle Mike!" he shouted, pulling Michael inside before James could process the moment. Sarah, flipping pancakes in the kitchen, raised an eyebrow, but smiled, her warmth a quiet force that eased the tension knotting James's chest. "Thought I'd bring breakfast," Michael said, setting the bagels on the table, his smile tentative but warm, like a man testing unfamiliar ground. "Figured we could talk. You know, like we used to." James nodded, his expression guarded, but not hostile. "Sure," he said, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs, the routine grounding him. "Ethan, grab some plates." The morning unfolded with an unexpected ease, a fragile normalcy James hadn't anticipated. Ethan dominated the conversation, his voice bright as he recounted a recent soccer game where he'd scored a goal, his hands waving as he described outrunning the defense. Michael listened intently, asking questions, his laughter loud and genuine, echoing their father's booming chuckle from years past. Sarah chimed in, teasing Ethan about the mud he'd tracked into the house after practice, her presence a steady anchor that kept the moment from tipping into awkwardness. James watched from his seat, his coffee cooling in his hands, his heart caught between the comfort of this scene and the unresolved weight of the cabin's loss. He wanted to hold on to this, Ethan's laughter, Michael's effort, but the memory of what was gone kept pulling him back. After breakfast, Ethan dragged Michael to the living room to show off a model rocket he'd built for a school science fair. its red and white plastic gleaming under the morning light filtering through the window. James followed, leaning against the doorway, listening as Michael praised Ethan's work, suggesting tweaks to make it fly higher. For a moment, James saw the brother he'd missed, the one who'd spent hours with him building a treehouse at the cabin, hammering nails with more enthusiasm than precision, their hands covered in sawdust. But the thought of the cabin brought the pain rushing back, sharp and unyielding, and James's voice cut through the moment, sharper than he meant it to be.
"So, what's the deal with Vance?" he asked, folding his arms across his chest. "You said you'd help Linda. Any progress on that?" Michael's smile faded, his shoulders tensing as he set the rocket down on the coffee table. Ethan glanced between them, sensing the shift in the air, and Sarah quietly ushered him upstairs to finish his homework, her hand gentle on his shoulder. The room grew still, the silence thick with the weight of their unresolved history. "I've been digging," Michael said, his voice low, cautious. "Vance isn't returning my calls, but I found some emails he sent me about the sale. I forwarded them to Linda. They show he pushed me to sign fast, said it was a one-time offer from a buyer who'd pay cash. I was desperate, James. I didn't read the fine print like I should have." James's jaw tightened, his skepticism flaring like a spark. "You didn't read it? You sold our cabin, our family's legacy, and you didn't even check what you were signing? You expect me to believe that?" Michael looked away, his hands rubbing together, a nervous habit James remembered from their childhood, when Michael would confess to breaking a toy or sneaking cookies. "I know how it sounds," Michael said, his voice rough with regret. "I was in over my head. Creditors hounding me, my business tanking, my accounts frozen. Vance made it sound like a lifeline, like I'd lose everything if I didn't act fast. I thought I was saving myself, not screwing you over." James shook his head, his voice steady but cold, each word measured. "You keep saying that, Mike, but you didn't tell me. You didn't give me a chance to help. You went behind my back, used some shady lawyer to take what was ours. You chose that over us." Michael's eyes met his, glistening with something raw, guilt maybe, or shame. "I was ashamed, James," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've always had it together, your job, Sarah, Ethan, this life you built here. I didn't want to admit I was failing again, that I'd made another mess. I thought I could fix it before you found out, pay you back, make it right." James felt a familiar pang, a mix of pity and frustration that twisted in his chest like a knot. He wanted to believe Michael, to see his brother's actions as a mistake born of desperation rather than malice. But trust was a fragile thing, and Michael had shattered it with a single signature. "You should have trusted me," he said, his voice softer now, heavy with the weight of their shared past. "We're family, Mike. That's supposed to mean something. Mom and Dad raised us to lean on each other, not this." Michael nodded, his expression raw, his hands still for the first time. "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm trying to make it right. Linda's got everything I have, emails, contracts, bank records. If there's a way to get something back, I'll make sure you get your share. I swear." James studied his brother, searching for sincerity in his eyes, wanting to find the boy who'd once looked up to him, who'd shared dreams under the stars at the cabin. He saw it, but it was tangled with doubt, a shadow cast by months of silence and betrayal. "What if there's nothing left?" he asked, his voice quiet but piercing. "What if the money's gone, the cabin's gone, and all we've got is this mess you made?" Michael didn't answer right away, his gaze dropping to the floor, his fingers tracing the edge of the couch. "Then I'll keep trying," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. "I owe you that, James. I owe Ethan. I don't know how, but I'll keep trying."
The mention of Ethan softened something in James, a reminder of the boy upstairs who deserved a family that wasn't fractured by greed or secrets. He thought of their parents, Ellen's gentle plea for them to care for each other, Tom's quiet pride in their brotherhood, the way he'd clapped them both on the shoulder after a day at the lake. "Stay in town," James said, the words coming slowly, like a decision made in mid-step. "Help Linda. Be here for Ethan. Show me you mean it, Mike." Michael's eyes widened, a flicker of hope breaking through the tension in his face. "I will," he said, his voice firm, a promise that carried weight, if only for the moment. "I'm not going anywhere." Over the next few weeks, Michael kept his word, staying in Boise and meeting with Linda regularly, his presence a tentative thread woven into the fabric of their lives. He came by the apartment often, bringing pizza for movie nights or helping Ethan with his rocket project, his enthusiasm genuine, his polished Phoenix persona fading with each visit. James watched, cautious but curious, noting the way Ethan lit up around his uncle, the way Michael seemed to relax in their small, cluttered home, shedding the weight of the life he'd chased. Sarah, ever the optimist, encouraged the visits, her warmth a bridge over the gap James wasn't ready to cross alone. She'd catch James's eye during these moments, her smile a quiet reminder that healing took time, but it was possible. One chilly evening, Linda called with a breakthrough. "We've got something solid," she said, her voice brisk but tinged with excitement. Vance's firm made critical errors in the sale, missing disclosures, improper filings, and a questionable transfer of funds. "We can sue for a portion of the proceeds, maybe even void the sale if the buyer's willing to negotiate. It's not a sure thing, but it's a real chance." James sat at the kitchen table, the phone pressed to his ear, Sarah beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "What's next?" he asked, his voice steady despite the hope stirring in his chest. "We file a claim," Linda said. "It'll take time, months, maybe longer. There's no guarantee we'll get the cabin back, but we might recover a significant amount, enough to make a difference for you and your family." James glanced at Sarah, who nodded, her eyes bright with cautious optimism. "Do it," he said. "Whatever it takes." After the call, James found Michael in the living room, playing a board game with Ethan, their laughter filling the space like a melody from a half-forgotten song. He watched them for a moment, Ethan's grin wide as he moved a game piece, Michael's smile genuine, unguarded, a glimpse of the brother James had missed. "Linda's got a lead," James said, his voice even, cutting through the laughter. "She thinks we can sue Vance's firm, maybe get something back." Michael looked up, his expression a mix of relief and guilt, his hands pausing over the game board. "That's good," he said, his voice soft. "I'll keep helping, whatever she needs. I want this to work, James." James nodded, the distance between them shrinking, if only by a fraction. "Stay for dinner," he said, echoing his words from weeks ago, the invitation, a small step toward something new. "We'll figure it out together." That night, as they sat around the table, James, Sarah, Ethan, and Michael, the conversation flowed with a tentative ease, like a river finding its course after a storm. Ethan talked about his school's science fair, his rocket now a point of pride. Sarah shared a story from the hospital, her laughter light as she described a patient's quirky request. Michael told a tale about a desert hike in Arizona that had gone hilariously wrong, his self-deprecating humor drawing chuckles from them all. James listened, his heart lighter, though not unburdened. The cabin was gone, its loss a scar that would always mark their story. But this, his family, his brother, these small moments of connection, was something real, something worth holding on to. Months later, Linda's efforts bore fruit. The lawsuit against Vance's firm settled out of court, yielding $50,000. Not the cabin, not their past, but enough to start a college fund for Ethan, to ease the financial strain on James and Sarah's modest life. Michael insisted the money go to James, refusing his share, his voice quiet but resolute as he stood in their living room one evening. "It's the least I can do," he said, his eyes meeting James's, holding a sincerity James hadn't seen in years. For the first time, James believed him, not fully, but enough to nod, to accept the gesture as a step toward healing. One bright spring afternoon, James took Ethan to a lake outside Boise. Not their cabin's lake, but close enough to carry its echo. Pine-scented air, the gentle lap of water against the shore. They cast fishing lines into the water, the sun warm on their shoulders, Ethan's laughter bright as he reeled in a small trout. Michael joined them, his presence no longer a surprise, but a part of their new rhythm. His jeans rolled up as he waded into the shallows with Ethan, teaching him to skip stones. James watched, his heart caught between the ache of what was lost and the quiet hope of what they were building. The stones skimmed across the water, each ripple a small promise of something new. Sarah sat on a blanket nearby, her smile soft, her eyes reflecting the lake's shimmer as she watched Ethan and Michael. Later, as they packed up their gear, she leaned close to James, her voice a gentle whisper. "You okay?" James nodded, his gaze on Ethan and Michael, their laughter mingling with the breeze, a sound that felt like home. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady, grounded. "We're getting there." The cabin was gone, its memory a bittersweet echo in their lives, a chapter closed but not forgotten. But in its place, James had found something else, a family, pieced back together. Not perfect, not whole in the way it once was, but strong enough to carry forward. Michael stayed in Boise, taking a job at a local tech firm, his visits to the apartment a regular part of their weeks. The money from the settlement grew in Ethan's college fund, a practical step toward a future James could now imagine without the weight of loss. And as they stood by the lake that day, the sun setting behind the pines, James felt a quiet peace, a sense that they'd found a way to honor their parents' memory, not with a place, but with each other.